Hello and welcome to Women's Health Grampians' first webinar in our conversation series. I'm Rose Dury, Manager of Strategy and Programs here at Women's Health Grampians, and I'm joined today by Helen Diamond, Family Relationships Worker at Selfcare Ballarat, to discuss the topic of gender, relationships and parenting in the pandemic. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on the Women's Health Grampians website in due course. I just want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that Helen and I are delivering this webinar from here in Ballarat, the Wadawurrung people, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. And I want to extend that acknowledgement to the traditional owners of the land across the Grampians region and Victoria, wherever you may be listening today. So, in this webinar, we will briefly touch on the issue of family violence, a subject that affects many of us. If this raises any issues or concerns for you, then please contact 1800-RESPECT, the National Sexual Assault Domestic Family Violence Counselling Service, 1800-737-732. So what we want to do today is provide a bit of an overview of the evidence that's emerging on the way that COVID-19 has impacted on relationships and families, and to cast a bit of a gendered spotlight over that. So I want to share some of that data on how it impacts differently on men and women, and Helen will then discuss the vital importance of self-care at the moment and talk about how this is playing out in couple and parental relationships in this time of pandemic. And if you have any questions, then please enter them into the chat box and we'll endeavour to answer them if time permits. So COVID-19, it's hard to avoid at the moment, but basically news reports started emerging in January this year of a virus that's now led to a global pandemic and a complete shift in how we work, how we school, how we socialise, and we're seeing that impact on our health system, our education system. We're seeing unemployment, underemployment and a likely recession. And of course the morbidity and mortality rates here in Victoria and across the world. And inevitably, this has a huge impact on individuals and families. Different groups of women will be impacted in different ways. And I just want to draw your attention to another webinar we're hosting in a few weeks about the experience of women from different backgrounds of this pandemic, and details will be on our website. So what happens in families in a time of crisis? Well, the existing division of labour and gendered social norms are exacerbated during and after disaster. Pandemics, emergencies, crises all worsen inequalities. There's a tendency to revert to stereotypical gender roles during times of crisis and uncertainty, where men are seen as protectors and decision makers and women as carers. And I just want to note that I am mainly talking about heterosexual couples in this respect. The burden of caring for children, the ill and the elderly all fall unequally on women. And family violence increases during and in the aftermath of a pandemic, particularly as people self-isolate and are at home without access to their usual support networks and services. And on Wednesday afternoon, we're hosting another webinar on family violence in the pandemic, and there are details on the Women's Health Grampians website. In terms of unpaid work, both men and women are doing more housework and childcare during the lockdown, but this work isn't being divided any differently or more equitably than before. Remote learning is an additional load as the pandemic has closed schools and limited childcare options. So for two-parent households, This division will depend on access to work flexibility and the current division of childcare within each family. And social norms around who does what will inevitably influence those decisions. What we know from many previous studies, including the last census in 2016, is that women spend longer on housework and childcare, and employed women spend longer on housework and childcare than employed men. There was a recent New York Times survey that many of you might have come across about domestic work during the pandemic, and it showed that nearly half of men in New York claimed that they did most of the homeschooling, but only 3% of women agreed with that. The University of Melbourne is currently researching how this is playing out in an Australian context, as are the Australian Institute of Family Studies. So in terms of paid work, female-dominated industries are really hard hit by the pandemic, either in the front line, so in health and service industries where women make up the bulk of employees, or in industries that have been severely impacted because of social distancing restrictions, such as hospitality and retail, where again women make up the majority of employees. More women have lost jobs than men in March and April, but men have suffered bigger pay cuts. And restrictions on school and childcare options, including care by family, by grandparents, by friends and neighbours, all impact on women's ability to work. We are seeing that women in Australia are 50% more likely to have stopped looking for work than men over the past 2 months, and that women are also more likely to be working from home than men. So this pandemic is really unique, and it's different to other disasters and economic crises because of that blow to school and childcare. Other recessions often hit male-dominated industries more heavily than female-dominated industries, and that's something that we need to think about. With schools and daycares closing or limited attendance at the moment, families face a very real juggle of work and school and parenting. And as we know, traditional ideas around who does what are often strengthened in crisis. Childcare means that women can work, and this improves productivity. It can increase spending during an economic downturn as more money is flowing through a household. Childcare and remote learning responsibilities are more likely to fall on women, with a considerable burden on working women and even more on single mothers and sole parents who are juggling all of this. There are some families where roles will be reversed and men will be the main providers of childcare. All of this matters because what we're seeing now is, on the one side, women are on the front line in the female-dominated industries of health, teaching and aged care. And on the other side, women are more likely to be in precarious casual employment in retail and hospitality. And the load carried by women with children is immense and undervalued by our society. Recovery must lead to a more equal world. This pandemic can provide us with an opportunity to reimagine gender roles, the nature of work, the division of labour within households, and the way that services are accessed. And this is all something for us to think really deeply about, to advocate for, and to start putting in place now. Of course, the personal is political, and I'm really excited now to turn to Helen, who's going to talk about how this is playing out in families in our region right now, and what we can do in our own households to help us cope with and process these very strange times. Thank you. Helen.
Thanks very much, Rose. It's really interesting to get the broader picture of the impact of the pandemic. Of course, the ripple effects are playing out locally as well. Since the onset of the pandemic, our organisation has seen a wide scope of responses, ranging from individuals and families who are facing extreme challenges and threats to safety, where existing vulnerabilities and stresses are exacerbated and compounded, through to families who have renewed their connections with each other and are enjoying this time when extraneous commitments are shed and they can revel in a newfound, slower pace. Having to adjust to sudden change with no clear sign of an end can throw us all into a spin and can lead to a whole cocktail of emotions bubbling up to the surface and potentially overflowing. Obviously, for a lot of families, the economic impact of the pandemic has created turmoil. The threat to safety via loss of income and housing is one of the greatest stressors we can experience. Interestingly, a recent report of some research being conducted into how people are coping indicated that on the whole, families in rural areas appear to be managing better than those in cities. For families where one or two parents are now working from home, this unprecedented situation of being in such close proximity to each other, coupled with the need to oversee children's schooling requirements, can take a lot of adjusting and accommodating. There are limited opportunities to meet everyone's needs, relieve stress, have a change of scenery, let alone finding some time for yourself. Families are also less able to access the supports and services they may have benefited from pre-pandemic. I'm thinking especially of those families caring for someone with a disability or with special needs. Prior to the onset of the pandemic, Australians were experiencing a loneliness epidemic. Social isolation only serves to enhance this, keeping in mind that it's very possible to feel lonely and isolated within the family unit. We've been living in social isolation for several weeks now, and it could be a good time to revisit and review how arrangements are working within your household. It's useful to consider what's working well and to take time to acknowledge and really celebrate this. Then to be able to think about what's not working that well, what might need to be tweaked or adjusted, bearing in mind that there's no right or wrong way of doing most things, as much as we would like to think our way is usually the right way. Under stress, we all regress, so it's important to go easy on ourselves and others. I think it's really helpful to consider your locus of control, to work out what's within your control and to focus on that, and to be able to, at some level, set aside that which is not within your control. So when thinking about navigating relationships, it's really important to firstly examine your own self-care. By being able to meet your needs, you're more likely to be able to meet the needs of others and therefore bring the best of yourself to your relationships. As far as self-care goes, I think it's really important to start with the basics. So look at the balance of nutrition, sleep, exercise and connection, or stimulation or creativity in your days, and to make any adjustments that may be required. Once again, several weeks into the pandemic could be a good time to review and revisit how satisfactorily these needs are being met. It's also so important to be able to carve out some time for yourself, and if possible to create a sanctuary in your home, which may be an armchair in the corner of a quietish room where everyone in the family knows that it's your space and yours alone to retire to from time to time. If you don't already, it could also be a really useful time to investigate opportunities to practice mindfulness throughout the course of your day. Doesn't necessarily mean finding 20 minutes to meditate daily, but it could be a series of a couple of minutes here and there during the day where you focus on bringing your attention to the here and now. Could be when you're in the shower, just taking some time to be fully present and enjoy the sensations of the shower. Could be when you're walking around the block to take time to notice your environment. Sitting or standing while you take 5 slow, deep breaths is a good way to ground yourself, to drop anchor, and to bring clarity to the situation. Stephanie Dowrick, in her book Choosing Happiness, Life and Soul Essentials, refers to the concept of setting your inner compass every day. So upon waking, take a few minutes to consider what this day may bring and what strengths and values you may need to call on. There are also opportunities throughout the day to reset your compass if things have gone off the rails. It can also be very helpful to check in with yourself throughout the course of the day, just to monitor how you're travelling and what's going on for you. Might be the time when you need to be kind to yourself and practice some self-compassion. If this doesn't come easily, perhaps imagine how you would respond to a friend should they be in a similar position, because often we are our own worst enemies. Keep in mind your values and what you stand for, and if possible, use these as reminders of how you would like to behave towards others in order to bring the best of yourself to your relationships. On those days when you're not being your best self, remind yourself that there are always chances to draw a line under whatever has just happened, make some repair attempts, and reset your compass. It's so important to keep a sense of humour, and wherever possible, find some moments of delight in your interactions with those around you. It's useful to think of the concept good enough, a good enough partner, good enough parent, good enough human being, and to be able to cut ourselves some slack from time to time. Reassigning the division of labour within two-parent households requires a great deal of respect, trust, and goodwill by both parties. If a couple can articulate their expectations to avert what is usually unspoken yet expected, is very helpful. It's not a time for mind reading and expecting your partner to just know how you'd like things to be done and what your needs are. Rather, it's more helpful to be able to express your needs clearly and calmly, and to be prepared to listen to your partner's needs as they're expressed as well. At Centrecare, we draw a lot on the work of John Gottman, who's an American psychologist who's been studying couple and parenting relationships for almost 50 years. And he talks about the importance of moving from me to we, to be able to work as a team, to avoid ledger keeping, and to practice scanning the relationship for positives, reminding yourself of those attributes you admire and respect in your partner as you negotiate. Gottman notes that in all couple relationships, 69% of conflict is perpetual and actually doesn't have a resolution. It's very helpful to see if you can identify what constitutes your 69%ers and choose not to go down that path if you can avoid it. If the discussion gets heated, it's helpful to take at least a 20-minute break and to return once both parties are feeling calm again. Most of the aforementioned also applies to the parenting relationship. It's so important to keep the parent-child relationship in mind when navigating these troubling times. To be able to make space for connecting emotionally with your children, to be able to see the world through their eyes, to practice empathy and compassion, and to remind yourself that behind every outburst and tantrum is an unmet need. And if possible, to be able to explore what this need might be through curiosity and kindness, at least some of the time. It's also important to be able to take a reflective stance and view our parenting relationships from an objective point of view, to be able to build in a pause between reacting and responding, at least some of the time, and to make repair attempts should we have overstepped the mark. When children are exhibiting challenging behaviours, it's our relationship with them that holds the key to addressing these. What we may think of as attention-seeking behaviour is in fact connection-seeking behaviour. The Circle of Security program, which we conduct at Centre Care, has a formula for maintaining a secure attachment with your children, something which is so important, especially during times of anxiety and change. Always be bigger, stronger, wiser and kind. Wherever possible, follow my child's need, and wherever necessary, take charge. If we're able to do this, we're much more likely to forge that strong connection with our children, and we're much more likely to be able to do this if we make our self-care a priority.
Thank you, Helen. That was really interesting. And when we think about kind of what's happening, we're inundated with what's happening in the bigger picture, to be able to hear how that relates to our own relationships and parenting and what's happening in our whole households. It's really, really valuable. We probably have time for one or two questions. So I've got one here. What are some of the positives that we can take away from this? I think probably both Helen and I can answer this one. In terms of kind of the big picture around gender, I think there are some exciting things. We're sort of seeing how businesses are kind of rapidly able to adapt in terms of flexible work arrangements. They're much more aware of the childcare needs of their staff. Many more fathers are involved in childcare and housework and remote learning. And also I think the roles of women are being more recognised and valued in these female-dominated industries of healthcare and teaching, are being lauded in a way that they haven't before, and we need to hold on to that. And what about from your perspective?
Yeah, well, definitely. I think there are a lot of positives that may come out of this. Also have to acknowledge that, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and as you've touched on, Rose, too, there are a lot of families who have really, really struggled, and the challenges that they've had have been amplified. But for some families, I think they'll look back on this time with perhaps some great fondness. For a lot of families, it's meant spending a lot more time together. I know with a few families I've spoken with who have adolescents, they're saying that their adolescents are actually venturing out from their bedrooms a little bit more frequently and hanging out with the family, which is a lovely thing and a lovely way of connecting with your adolescents. I know for some families where perhaps the children haven't been very happy at school, if there's been some school refusal, I've heard that, in those instances, the children who have in the past not felt that comfortable about going to school are really flourishing with the remote learning situation. I think, the fact that we've all had to be catapulted into being able to navigate our way around technology has meant that family members who are living geographically apart have greater access to actually see each other, to have those face-to-face connections. I think, it really has, this time has really forced people to reconsider their priorities and maybe reconsider how they'll do things once this comes to an end, or sort of gets a little bit closer to the normal that we were experiencing prior to this.
Yeah.
And of course, pet ownership has zoomed. And we were saying before, it depends whether you've got a dog or a cat. Dogs seem to just love it, and cats.
And my cat is over it.
Yes.
Yes, definitely. We've got another question, Helen. This one's more for you. Are there any online services that can help families, like free counselling?
Free counselling? Not quite sure about free counselling, but definitely I know at Centrecare, Family Relationships Program is very happy to support families in any way we possibly can. Might have to do some investigation about the actual free counselling. I know that as far as the parenting side of things go in our program, all of our parenting consults are free of charge. But yeah, I'm not 100% sure about the availability of free counselling elsewhere.
Yeah, and we'll actually email all the participants for the webinar today in the next few days. We'll email some further resources from both my part of the presentation and also Helen's, and that includes details of the intake worker at Centrecare Ballarat. Is that right, Helen?
Yes, yeah.
So we will do that in the coming days. And I'm just conscious of time, really. So we will be sending out these further resources in the next few days, and also keep an eye on the Women's Health Grampians website for the details about upcoming webinars on a gendered kind of spotlight over this COVID-19 pandemic. We are, as I said before, recording this webinar, and that will go up on our website in the next few days. Contact details, my contact details are on the screen there, and also the intake coordinator's contact details, which will also go out in the further resources document in the next few days on the screen. And of course, get in touch with us, chat with us if there's anything that you would like to talk to us about. But in the meantime, thank you for your time. Thank you, Helen, for chatting with me.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Our pleasure. And yeah, we hope to see you on our next webinar on Wednesday afternoon. Thank you.